Hi, my name is Mark Klein, and I'm the moderator tonight for this, what I know will be a very, very interesting evening because our guest is a fascinating person. First, I just want to thank Barbara's Bookstores for hosting this event. I was very fortunate to actually be on the other side of the table a few weeks ago, and here I'm thrilled to be back. It's a wonderful series of bookstores. There are 4 stores in the greater Chicago area and several stores in the O'Hare Airport. Uh, just want to let you know that Barbara's offers a 10% discount on Ed's book. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, there should be a solid green button. And if you hit that, it'll take you directly to the link to buy Ed's book and get a 10% discount. Also, there's free shipping on any order of greater than $25. So again, thank you to Barbara's. And I think we'll get going. First, let me tell you a little bit about Ed Hagem, our guest tonight. Ed Hagem is the son of a Syrian immigrant. He's a seasoned Wall Street executive with more than 50 years of investment experience. He has held senior management positions with the Capital Group, E.F. Hutton, and Lehman Brothers before becoming chairman and CEO of Furman Sells. He's been the co-chairman of ING Barings, America's region, chairman and CEO of ING, if I pronounce this right,
Altus.
Altus Group, and ING Furman Sells Asset Management, and chairman and CEO of MLH Capital. He is now chairman of High Vista, a Boston-based money management company. In 2008, after 20 years as a trustee of the University of Rochester, Ed began an 8-year tenure as chairman of the university's board. Upon assuming that office, he gave the school $30 million, the single largest donation in school history, to support scholarships and endow the Edmund A. Hagem School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. Through the Hagem Family Foundation, Ed has made generous donations to organizations that promote education, healthcare, arts, culture, and conservation. In 2015, he received the Horatio Alger Award. That's quite an honor if you're not familiar with it, given to Americans who exemplify the values of initiative, leadership, and commitment to excellence, and who have succeeded despite personal adversities. And you're going to find out tonight, and when you read this wonderful book, that Ed has succeeded despite incredible adversities. So here's Ed's book, The Road Less Traveled, An Unlikely Journey from the Orphanage to the Boardroom. So I think, Ed, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to do this. This is a great thrill for me. So the first question I want to ask you is about the title of your book, On the Road Less Traveled. So tell us why you chose that particular title.
That's a very good question. Before I start, though, I want to thank Barbara's Books as well. I want to thank Laura for all the work she did on the technical side to get us two non-techs all squared away here for this evening. And my wife, I want to recognize that my wife, her name is Barbara also. So this is quite an evening for all of us. And she's on this telecast. It was a very interesting decision because there are a lot of titles that we went through. But if you look at my life, in many respects, I did travel on the road less traveled. Let's just start off with the road from an orphanage from the chairman to the chairman of the board is a road less traveled. But even the very beginning, I was in my high school period, I decided to go to a private college where most of the kids in the orphanage, if they went to college at all, went to a public college. So I traveled the road less traveled to a private college, which changed my life. In the service, I had a wonderful service career. Most people at that point in time would have stayed. And many of my buddies did stay. So I left the service and took another road less traveled to the engineering profession. And I did very well at Hercules, and I was all ready to go. And all of a sudden, I took another road. I went to Harvard Business School with not enough money for the first year's tuition, another road less traveled. And as I traveled in my business, I think some of my successes were, I always looked at the road less traveled. Almost all of the strategies we took, and in fact, working for a small firm for most of my life. By the way, if you listen to all my different jobs, you saw that I had a little trouble keeping my job. I did change jobs a couple of times. A couple of those companies were all the same. I spent nearly 20 years with Furman Sells as a chairman and CEO. We sold it a couple of times. So I became chairman of other companies in the companies who bought us. But even there, it was a road less traveled. I would sit down and ask my partners, what's next? Where can we go that others haven't gone? So it kind of seemed to be a theme. And then, of course, going back to the beginning, the road less traveled was the road from St. Louis to Los Angeles, where my father kidnapped me. That was a road that almost nobody traveled. during that period of time. And one of my close friends really says, the book should have been On the Road Rarely Traveled, which I
Yeah,
thought
I'd
was
say
kind of funny.
so. So Ed, let me ask you another question. First of all, I just want to tell our viewers that I spoke to Ed beforehand, and there are so many fantastic themes in this book. You know, a biography is often a chronology. It's a story of somebody's life. But this book is a lot more than that. This book is not only a chronology, it's through the chronology of Ed's life. There are many, many very important themes that come out that are going to be of value for everybody. So rather than go through each one of these many jobs that you couldn't seem to keep, we're going to leave that out, and we're going to talk more about some of the themes, because I want to leave the fun journey, which it is when you read this book, the fun journey from Ed's very early childhood, very, very early childhood, at the age of 3, all the way through this point of his life. So we're gonna leave that out. I'm gonna leave it to you readers to buy the book and enjoy it, because it's really worth it. You're gonna have a lot of fun when you read it. So we're gonna focus instead on some of the themes. So tonight, I think, is a fun night for me, because it's not often I get to spend time with somebody who's as optimistic as I am. I'm a very big optimist. And when I started talking to Ed, I realized, wow, he's another really big optimist. And he talks about optimism a lot in his books. Ed, why don't you talk about why you think it's better to be an optimist, and what is the value of optimism in somebody's life? Why be an optimist?
Well, it doesn't, I found a number of times, it doesn't do you any good to look backwards. All right? It doesn't look good. If you look at the world very carefully, it's always better to be optimistic than pessimistic. And by the way, I live my life in the stock market. So in general, the stock market goes up most every year. 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4 years, it goes up. So if you're pessimistic, you're really only right once in a while. And in most cases, you can send your optimism to the people you're working with. And I found that I surrounded myself with people who were optimistic. I always did better. And I found that in pessimism, no matter what you deal with in pessimism, it doesn't help you at all in anything you're doing. And one of my themes was aim high. You can't aim high if you're a pessimist, And then I used to end all my speeches when I was a strategist for many years on Wall Street, giving big predictions about what was going to go on in the market. And when we were in bear markets, when things were really bad, I always ended with, the world doesn't come to an end very often. And that was true, And if you look back, when the things were the worst, that was the time you should have been buying and being involved. And in many respects, even COVID, being optimistic about COVID, I've been talking to the president of the University of Rochester, which I'm very much involved with. And I kept saying, what's positive about COVID? There's so many positive changes which are going to occur with COVID. Telemedicine. I mean, our hospital up in Rochester has increased the number of telemedicine calls by 100-fold. And the savings are enormous. I mean, what many people don't know about Rochester, I guess Chicago has the same kind of problems. You get in your car, you drive through the snow, you get to the hospital, you walk from the parking lot to the hospital, you get into the doctor's office, you wait for an hour, you finally get through, you do the same thing on the way home, versus getting on your phone, looking at somebody attractive like Mark here, and talk to him about your problem. And in 9 out of 10 times, you can solve it. So telemedicine is a big breakthrough. I mean, education is going to completely think. So no matter what you're pessimistic about, it doesn't do you much good. And if you spend pardon the theories, but I believe there's a certain amount, you only have a certain amount of psychic energy. If you place that on the positive side, you get something out of it. You place it on the negative, it just gets more negative. I mean, and by the way, I found out, I went through some depression periods in my early life, and I found it did me no good at all. It didn't make me a person that people wanted to be with. It didn't make me a happy person, and it didn't produce any results. And I found it, if you're even overly optimistic and you're kind of, I used to not like those kind of people who are always smiling and happy, but I found out they were much better off than I was. And what I've been very lucky in all my life is I've kind of taken the best from the people I've been associated with. And one of the things is, I think over a lifetime, I've converted. If you talk to me back there when I was in high school or college, I was a little bit of a pessimist because things didn't work well for me.
Well, you had reason to be.
I got converted over time. I got converted over time by people I associated with, and also by results. You try things out, they work. I tried out optimism and it worked, so I kept going. And I think if you send the message to optimism to the people around you, boy, I think things really change. They really do.
I completely agree. I'll tell you a quick story. When I was in my early years of my practice, we had a group of people sitting around a table, and something happened, something that wasn't particularly good. And I sort of turned it around and said, yeah, but if you look at it this way, and one of my partners looked at me and goes, how is it that you can find the silver lining in every dark cloud? And I thought about that and I went, how is it you can't? Right.
That's right.
So you feel much better when you're an optimist. That's for sure. And I think what you said about converting, when people read your book and they find out at 3 years old, you were basically abandoned, people would say, oh my God, Ed is the ultimate victim. How could he ever be optimistic? How could he ever be forward thinking? And yet here you are. So I think the story of your life is a great story of why optimism is such a valuable asset.
And you captured the word. When I came early on, and I guess that's probably part of my conversion, I refused to be a victim. No matter what happened to me, I wouldn't be a victim. I said to myself, no, you're not going to, no self-pity. Fact is, I buried my life because I didn't want any sympathy or pity. So if you're not a victim, then you end up looking forward. You say, well, this is back there. And by the way, pessimism is much easier than optimism. You can generate all kinds of negative viewpoints. But if you look at the world, go back and look at that world. The world never doesn't come to an end very often. And those people who have been optimistic and take advantages of what's going on, and that's energy expansion. You extend your energy into something like optimism, you get answers and good answers, and it carries you. And I really believe you have a limited amount of what I call psychic energy every day. And if you spend it on being optimistic, and the reflection you get off people when you're optimistic, just like your example. How can you see a silver lining in almost anything? Well, sure enough, if you practice that, when something negative comes up, you start doing that, and it becomes a habit. That's what happened with me.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, which kind of moves us into another very similar topic I'd like you to talk about, and that's adversity. You say in your book, actually, I think in the preface of the book, before you even get into the meat and potatoes, that adversity is a gift, and if you don't experience it, you won't know how to handle it. And people might say again, gee, he had all this adversity and yet he's an optimist. Talk about your view of adversity and how that can be a very.
This was a little bit of a late discovery for me. Somewhere along in my business career, I started to not only tick off my so-called capabilities, business school and business talents and other things. I started to take some of my personality characteristics and decided to try to analyze where they came from. I used to use yellow pad, and I write it down. I was very adaptable. Why was I adaptable? I mean, when Hutton said, who wants to go to Japan? Nobody wanted to go. I went. When I would change jobs from one to the other, I was able to adjust the new job very quickly. Well, if you live in 15 to 20 different places between 3 and 18, you become adaptable. If you're in 5 different Catholic primary schools, you find your place. You find out who beats you up and who you beat up. And you finally find your place. So adaptability was something that I gained those first 18 years. And I started to recognize that was a gift.
So, and let me ask you a question before you continue, so that our listeners understand. So at 3 years old, that began your journey into orphanages, foster homes first, then orphanages. How many different places did you live in?
Wait, I counted 15, I think closer to from 0 to 3, we were in a half a dozen places because Dad couldn't find work. Between 3 and 5, there were these 2 hotels plus a woman I stayed with, so another 3. Then there were 5 foster homes, the YMCA in New York, W.T. Sloan House on 34th Street. Then there was the Coney Island Hotel and then 2 orphanages. It adds up to about 15 different places and different environments completely. I mean, the difference between a Catholic school and a Jewish orphanage is a pretty big difference. Or between one of the biggest changes was when we had a hotel room in Coney Island, 1.5 rooms. My father and I lived together. He was out most of the time because he was looking for work, but I had my own bed and I had my own bathroom and everything else. When I went to the orphanage, I ended up in a room with 50 other guys. My bed had a drawer underneath it. I took my whole dresser drawer, had to put it all in that drawer. The bathroom had 10 shower heads and 10 sinks. So a totally different experience, but I had to adjust. And that adjustment and things just like that, and then going different schools, there is a rites of passage whenever you go. I mean, all of you have been out there. You change schools, there's a rites of passage. There are cliques that you see. So you got to find out where you fit. And I had to do that a couple, 3 times. And I had to, 10 or 15 times. Doing that gave me a capability, really a gift of being adaptable to almost any circumstance. And it allowed me to react to things less harshly. When things really went wrong, it wasn't so bad. I had that before.
It sounds actually like a superpower.
It is, to some extent. And then you go to the second thing, resilience. What is adaptable is also, you got to be resilient, because if you get into a new situation, it doesn't work right away. You got to try and try and try. And resilience is like a muscle. If you use it more and more, sure enough, it becomes stronger. And the same thing with perseverance. Beyond resilience is perseverance. Sometimes in some of those situations, I didn't make it because I just didn't get along with the kids. So I had to keep moving. And it was difficult. Or the families I lived with, sometimes they were, the first family was very, very difficult. I had to persevere my way through there. Then what it does, after you go through all of this, you have much less anxiety as you get older. You come across at Lehman Brothers, I was very successful. I still got thrown out. Some people would go down and say it's a huge, have a psychological breakdown. I went on to the next thing, and then finally,
you was just another change, and you were used to change.
And when I dealt with people, having gone through what I've gone through, I had empathy. If a guy got divorced, or he lost his job, or his kid was sick, or he grew up, some of the people I dealt with had some of the background like I did. I had empathy with them. I said, I understand what you've gone through, why you have demons. Because most people go through what I go through, have demons. They get kicked, and I had some too. Sunday, I have demons, but most weekdays I don't. And then probably the most important thing that I got out of my background, which is gratitude. Somewhere in my 40s or 50s, I started to feel very grateful. And right now, at my age, when people ask me, how are you? They always ask how you are. I said, I'm grateful. And that's a very, very important consideration. And all those things came from my background. I gave the Horatio Alger speech to 100 Horatio Alger kids whose backgrounds many of them were worse than mine. I mean, there was one young lady that I fell in love with. She was going to a university, and I got talking to her, and she lived in a mobile home for 2 years, her junior and senior year in high school. And I said, that's terrible. It's much worse than my background. She said, it was worse than my little sister who also lived with me.
Oh my
God. I said to these kids, I said, you are very lucky. And you could see the question marks come out of the crowd, Why are we lucky? Why we have this horrible background? I said, you could live the American dream. My children can't. And that's one of the things
And let's talk about that, because I'm glad you brought that up. So you grew up with a lot of adversity. And I look back on my life, certainly nothing like yours, but I had, as I might have mentioned to you privately, I've had certain episodes as well. Our kids all have grown up with almost none, right? So does that worry you? Do you concerned about kids who grow up with no adversity? On the one hand, you couldn't possibly imagine denying your children something that you can give them, right? Certainly, of course, love, which you had in short supply in your life. But so it's hard to imagine not giving them what we can. On the other hand, you have the Ed Hagem problem, right? How do you get the resilience and strength that you have without adversity? What do you think of that?
I made all mistakes in the book with my children. Doesn't sound like mistakes, but let me tell you, I found the best community that I could possibly find, Greenwich, Connecticut, which had the finest schools. I send them both my daughter and my sons to the finest private schools in Greenwich, Connecticut. They went to we took vacations in great places. And somewhere in there, I came up with the conclusion that wasn't such a good idea. But I was stuck because I lived on 8 acres. I really wanted to give my kids what I didn't have. Then I started to realize it. So I put in a couple of things that I was a YPO. When you go to YPO meetings, and there are people there who tell you how to handle your kids. And I ran
Explain what YPO is.
It's Young Presidents Organization. If you're the president of a company under the age of 40, there's a group of 6,000 men and women around the world that go into an organization. You have to be elected into it. And they have these forum groups which you meet and talk about your problems. And then they have these universities which you go to, and they go through various things. And one of the things in these universities was people who talked about family life. It was broken down between culture, education, business, and family. And I loved to always go to the family ones. And I ran across a couple of psychologists. One was Dr. Zink. And he said, if your kids don't have any adversity, if they don't go through any difficulties, and he looked at the crowd, they're all presidents of companies. He said, they will have anxiety later on. You've got to give them tests. So I started making each one of them work in the summertime. And I remember my daughter drove an ice cream truck for the summer. When you drive an ice cream, first of all, she got the truck. She came home. She said, Dad, I've got this wonderful job. I got an ice cream truck. I said, where are you going to plug it in at night? We had to go get 220 and with an electrician in that night, get Anyway, she had to sell ice cream all day long, learn at the end of the day to get rid of the inventory, go to a place where you could sell a low price, because she had to fill the truck up the next morning. She didn't fill the truck the next morning. For a couple of days, they take the truck away from her. She learned. My son did mowed grass. But more importantly, he can do what I call artificial experiences. Outward Bound, which you're not familiar with that. They send kids on trips, and actually parts of the trips, some of the kids spend their time alone. I took my son and I went down the Green River together in a raft. And, you get out in the Green River, and at night you come in, you sleep on the ground, you find the potty out in the boondocks someplace, and you spend 5 or 6 days out there on the water, in white water. I sent my son to Knowles National Outdoor Leadership School. Part of his training, he spent in Alaska for 2 months, 30 days in the rain. When you go through 30 days in the rain, first of all, you build enormous relationship with the people you're with. You have shared experience like none other. You have common things. You're not the fancy kid from the fancy school. You're just another kid. And if you do something, you help somebody out, they fall down in the mud or anything else that happens. I mean, on this trip down the river, so many people helped us and we helped them to get through it, because these are the rapids, boats turned over. It was a great experience. Those things later on, what happens to becomes sort of, you can do it. I did it before. And my background was I did so much as a youngster that almost anything that I went through was sort of better. When I went from one orphanage with 50 people in a room to an orphanage with 3 guys in a room, that was a big deal. Then I went to college when I had a room with 2 desks and only one other person, was even better. So one of the problems that I have a chapter in the 3rd book. It's called Get Rich Slowly, or Improve Slowly over a lifetime, so you can absorb all this. But it isn't for parents who do well, and I was trying to do a good thing, best community, best schools, not the best thing in the world. You got to give them trials. And my middle son took it on very well. He gave himself trials. He graduated from college. He got a job in Australia and spent the whole year hitchhiking in Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, worked in bars and restaurants, and he came back a new man. And so I think either they do it themselves, or you try to encourage them to do it, to really get out there alone. Camp is a wonderful thing. I mean, our kids go to a camp in Lake Dunmore up in Vermont, my grandchildren, and they come back different kids because they've been out there all alone. And by the way, when on my first year in the Navy, when I was a midshipman, they shaved everybody's head, whether you came from a great school or you're an orphan. And it was a great experience. So I think it's hard for parents, because we get a chance to go through it. Life is family of self, most important thing. Got to solve that in first 18 to 25 years. Family comes next, the most important thing. Work seems most important, it isn't. And community. Got these 4 things you got to keep balancing. And that family thing really has to be worked on, because whether you're an orphan or you're very rich, you're still going to have some kind of problem, some kind of balance in it. And so I find that making, even artificially, sending your grandchildren or convincing your grandchildren to go places, alone. Now, we do take our kids on vacation. I'm a big nut on vacation. Spend quality time with your children. And we started with these trips, once every 2 years, take them to someplace they'd never go before, the southern tip of Chile or Egypt or Africa or something like that. But I also wanted them to go alone places. Being alone is a big deal. Then also take out each child alone someplace. They're very different when you have 3 kids like we did, and you take one by themselves, they change.
So let's talk about something very similar to what you're talking about. So you're talking in a way about having to learn things about life. And you spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about learning, that life is, I think a quote is, life is about continuous learning, and that you can always learn, become a better person. So first is talk about why you think that's so important. Why do you think it is that we need to continuously learn? What's the goal of continuous learning? Why are you so strongly in favor of that?
Someone said to me, which I think the great quote is, life is a road that's always under construction, or life is one constant learning, because you are changing. I mean, I have these, what I call 4 Ps at the end of the book. You have to start to focus on your passions, and they will change over a lifetime. They will change because of input of education and so forth. And the way the world is changing, I mean, it's a cliche to say that things are changing rapidly. I've just recommended to Harvard Business School and to Rochester that they bring back alumni every 5 years to be redipped. Think of me. I graduated the University of Rochester in '58 when I was I was basically programming a computer with steel pegs. 3 years in the Navy, and I came back. Computer had come back in completely. I needed a re-education. I mean, it's really very important. Technology is one of the biggest, most important things, and it changes so rapidly. We really have to be re-educated, not only the technology itself, but the social impact of technology. I mean, I am actually coming into my own now, talking as fast as I do, because if you've gone to Hamilton, I kind of am. I'm sort of stuttering my way through this thing. But you know, I mean, I watched Hamilton and The King and I, and it really brought everything home. The world has completely changed. I mean, the people who live, King and I, every word was said carefully. And Hamilton, you could barely catch it. I mean, it went so quickly. So that's why I think continuing education, no matter what you do, and you know as a doctor, one reason, by the way, I left engineering is that 25% of my time had to be spent on keeping up. And the big negative in engineering is you had to keep up on the right things. If you started to spend too much time in the wrong technology, and I saw 20 men at Hercules who were in water technology, and they kind of did some of the wrong things over 5 or 7 years. And one morning the company said, "You're out of here. We're going to get out of your part of water technology." So keeping up is very, I mean, engineers spend 25, doctors spend 25% of their time just keeping up. Almost everything is required. And I think more and more, not back in the 50s, you could learn something and it would stick around for a while. Now it almost becomes useless and hurts you. And so I think,
I'll give you an example with medicine. One of the greatest innovations or uses of the internet is that it is incredibly simple to look something up now. And there are all kinds of available. I subscribe to something that costs $500 a year, but I can look up anything I want instantaneously, and I have multiple sources like that. Whereas, because as you said, things are changing so fast. So, you know, to me, when I look at the internet, I don't see social media, right? I see the ability to obtain knowledge instantaneously and up-to-date knowledge that has been revised within the months. You know, in the old days, you had to go to the shelf, find the book you wanted. And that book was written, you know, 3, 4, 5 years ago. You're doomed if you do that today. And not only in medicine, I think you're doomed, like you said, in engineering and in all fields.
Almost anything today. Well, look, I mean, I can remember the Catholic school. We spent hours and months on spelling, you know?
Are you looking something up?
Siri, how do you spell perspicacity? You know, and Siri does it. You know, I mean, it's a piece
That's
of cake,
great.
and
Yeah.
you know, it's true. And think about all the hours, and of course, the first the calculator, first the slide rule, which I used, you know, which was not that accurate. And then, you know, when I graduated college, we were not allowed to use calculators because all people couldn't afford them.
Right.
So you think of the huge change today. You don't even think about it. You know, it's all done for you. And the change is accelerated. No, one of the problems is society is not keeping up with technological change. So that continuing education, and I'm a big at Harvard, we're going hammer and tongs toward continuing education, bringing people back and retraining them. And by the way, I believe this is as important at Harvard as is in carpentry and electricians and everything else. Because my mini crusade now is vocational education, which is also changing. Think about, I mean, the guy that helps me with my computer is harder to get an appointment with than my doctor. And we need a lot more of those kind of guys. And this thing continues to change.
Yes. So one of the things that struck me is you talk about the fact, you mentioned again, this is very early in the book, that all of the steps of your life brought you to where you are. And you and I talked a little about this, about you can't just change one event in your life. And I think this is a very important topic for people to understand that you are a summation of all the events that occurred, and you can't just pick one out and change that one. You have to come back and change the whole story. Why don't you talk about why you put that in the book and why that's so important? This idea that all the steps of your life brought you to where you are.
Well, you know, again, a cliche, if you'll pardon me, that, you know, the pencil of life has no eraser. That's just it. It's there, and it's impacting you, and you've got to understand. That's why I say that life is self, family, work, and community. The self must be understood, and it has all the things in it, and you have to recognize why you do what you do. One of the things about writing this book, and one reason I decided to take it public is I want people to spend time thinking about what makes them who they are. And it sounds corny, but I had to find out why I was angry. I had to find out why I did certain things well, why I did certain things poorly, why I reacted to certain people well, and how I reacted to certain people poorly. And because these are all, there's an old joke which I won't tell, but you're affected by two things overall. One is the environment externally. What you go through is what you're talking about. Also, your genealogy. That's one thing, and I shouldn't give the book away, but, my mother, I only had half my genealogy. I only knew what my father brought. You had to understand what your father brought. In fact, if you go to a doctor like yourself for the first time, the first thing he does is he goes back through your genealogy. What diseases do your father have? Well, what mental kind of things? My father was an angry man. I was angry for part of my life. Still, the anger comes out every once in a while. I picked that up. He was a man that, was many places would go silent completely. Occasionally, I would go silent. So there's certain genes in there that I had to get my hands around. And then, of course, I had to deal with my environment. I had to understand, just like I told you, that these disadvantages did turn into advantages. There were also disadvantages that stayed disadvantages. I had to realize I didn't ride a bicycle well. I never really learned to swim. I was never really comfortable with my skin until maybe my 40s. I always felt like my clothes didn't look good on me, because originally my clothes didn't look good on me, and I carried that forward. So each person has to go back and spend time. And that's why this second book I hope to write, and I've got it almost written, is this concept that your inner voice is the only constant in life, and the ability to develop a healthy conversation with it. I mean, one that's good, because the healthy voice, the inner voice can do a lot of damage too, but you got to learn to talk to it and understand who you are. So when you make a mistake, which is going to happen, you understand why, and you maybe not do it again.
This idea that you just brought up, I think is really so important. This idea of introspection, because people would look at you and they go, and they say they don't know your life until they read the book, and they just look and you go, look, he's a fantastically successful guy. Look what he's accomplished, and so on. He's won all these awards. He's done so well in business. He has a school in a college named after him with a bronze statue out front. Wow. Then you read your book, and when people read your book, they're going to go, wait a minute, right? How did he get from here to there? And I think one of the things that you're pointing out is so important is that you are recognizing your weaknesses, the negatives in your life, and you're confronting them, either turning them around or dealing with them, somehow facing them, and that a life is molded. A life isn't you're not born as a statue. You mold the statue as you go. And I think as people read this book and go through the different chapters, they'll start to realize, I think it's very easy to internalize and say, well, God, I've had, maybe I didn't live in an orphanage, but I've had some of I felt that way. I was angry. I felt alone. I felt left out. I felt unloved.
Exactly.
And I guess that's not really an obstacle to getting to become successful in so many ways.
100% right. And, that's another reason why I'm going somewhat public. I wasn't going to go public with the book. I was going to produce it for my family and close friends. But people started reading the galleys and said, I can associate with that. And I can understand that. Mine wasn't exactly the same, but here's what I took from that experience. So if I can get you readers to associate with part of my book and it helps you, then I've done my job. And that's when, when you get to be my age, all you're trying to do, and I hate to say it, Marcus, and much the same, more in the same camp, I think, you want to help a few people. You want to help them by giving them your experience, which will maybe soften the bumps or the lumps that they go through, or maybe prevent them. And I'll give you one big example. As I went through my early life, I was successful in the Navy, very successful. I got out in engineering. I really knocked the cover off the ball at Hercules. I had 7 patent applications. They loved me. I went to Harvard Business School and I graduated with distinction. I went to the first job. Within 2 years, I was one of the best performing money managers there. I was so full of myself. I said, well, guys, I want to own my own company. They helped me form my own company. And my inner voice and I got a disease. It's called hubris. And hubris is terminal. Now, I didn't show that. I wasn't around pushing people around, but inside I felt that I was invincible. So all of a sudden, this company got to a certain size and I lost you see in the book, I lost my marketing capability. Somebody else was marketing my product for me. So I decided I would market it, I would manage it, and I would manage the people. I could do anything. I was 35 years old. I had 5 clients. They wanted 4 meetings a year all over the country, 20 meetings, get on a plane and go. Well, I found out that wasn't true. the hubris got to me. I lost track of the market because I was doing these other things. And I realized, and that gave me an enormous experience. It was a great experience for me because I learned, first of all, humility of the first order. But I learned maybe the most important thing in my life career. You're only as good as the people you surround yourself with. And you've got to find partners who do things that you either don't want to do or can't do. And that goes way back. But that's really the whole mechanism that people have to go through. The learning about yourself and talking to yourself and building this history with yourself so that when you make a mistake, I recognized hubris. I have actually had a sign in my office that hubris is terminal. And it was at that point in time because I had to give up. I sold the company back to its parent and went about my business taking a new job. So
it's only terminal if you never learn the lesson that it can be terminal.
No, what you're looking for, if you can do it, is greatness wrapped in humility. That's a very, very funny little expression because it's by its nature, it's not humble, but you really want to be as great or as good as you can be. You want to wrap it constantly in humility because, you get slammed every time you step out of that mode of being humble. Be thankful. And, I got one of the greatest questions ever from a senior at University of Rochester. He looked at me and said, do you think you're blessed or lucky? And I didn't take a minute. I said both.
Of course. So staying with a similar theme, you mentioned that there were several people along the way who served as what you called, I believe, moral exemplars. The people that weren't in it for the money. I think you started with one of the women who took you
Mrs.
in.
Robb. Yeah, Mrs. Robb.
We took you in very young, people that showed empathy and compassion. So these people that you ran into, how did they help? I assume, I'm going to make the assumption that they helped set your course to some degree. Can you talk about how those particular people made such a difference for you?
Again, why did I write the book, and what did the book do for me? And looking back over my life, I started to recognize this somewhere in my 50s, that it wasn't all me, that there was pieces back there that really added to my whole mosaic of life. Mrs. Robb was a really, really good person. And she had only one child.
Explain who she is. Ed,
Mrs. Robb was my last foster parent, 1946.
And how old were you then?
Only 6 months. And she wrote
How old were you at that time?
I was 10.
Okay.
And she took me in at 10. She had a 10-year-old son, or 9-year-old. No, he was 10 years old. She wanted a partner for him. She couldn't have another child, and she wanted another child. She treated me just like him. I got everything he got. He was taking piano lessons. I took piano lessons, and so forth. But she conveyed to me true familial love. There was a real love, and you'll see she wrote some letters in there. They're in the book. She really cared for me. She cared that I was too skinny. She wanted to put weight on me and so forth. And she offered my father that if he couldn't take me, she'd take me back and so forth. So she was, but this was all recognized later on. That's why I say what I can get to people, if people can recognize, like when I was in the orphan home, the boss was named Ruben Koftoff. He was really interested in me, and he took really attention. He took attention to my well-being. I wouldn't take any of his advice because I was an independent, and I was wrong. I was wrong. But looking back at that, all the things he gave me, I did absorb. And as time went on, I started to realize all of these people throughout my life added to my mosaic. And if I could have accepted them better early, or could have accepted their love, their interest better, I'd have been more successful, much more, and happier. If you read the book, you sort of sense, as my wife says, in the last chapter, I asked her what she wanted for her birthday. She said, I want you to be happier. She always used to say, he's funny, but he's not fun. And because I was always very serious, and it's true.
My wife says that I'm not funny at all. I find that very distressing.
You got to be funny because
life, right.
Humor is one of the most important things. But that sort of process, if you can absorb the people along the way. Steve Bletcher, who came to me in Lehman Brothers and spent 35 years together, being the guy who did everything I couldn't do. A lot of things I could do, but better than I could do them. He left me with the things that I do well that I'd like to do. And he's my partner, and we're still, good friends. And my doctor, which was with me for 40 years. These are people that contribute to your life. But I'm not saying my book is trying to communicate to you, recognize it at the time. Don't wait half your life and then be grateful to that particular person. And it makes the relationship so much better. I still feel unhappy about my conversation with the head of the last orphanage, because he was really a good person. He really was interested in me, and I was at the time I was a ward of the state. My father and I were incommunicado, and he really replaced my father. But I really rejected his goodwill. I subtly absorbed it though, because the things he communicated to me, because he was a good person, I picked that up, and it helped me be a better person.
You know, one thing you mentioned is that you wish you could have done some of these things or appreciated these things when you were younger. But I think you answer your own question in this book, because life is an amalgam of all. It's a summary. It's a summation of all the things that happen. And so you've already been so successful. I think none of us can, as you said before, can go back. There's no erasing the past. And I think the fact that we do accumulate all these relationships and this knowledge from these people, you can't always do it at the time, but at some point the light goes on, and I think you are a perfect example of that. I want to ask you one more question before we get questions from the audience, and this I think is very important. You mentioned that you need to pick yourself up after falling. Abandon the road is not the end of the road. So for me, I always like to say that the difference between those who succeed and those who don't is that those who succeed are the ones who don't give up. And I think, why don't you talk about that idea, that because you've had to pick yourself up on more than one occasion. People look at you and they go, come on, how tough could it have been? Look at him, right? 3 houses, he's doing great, right? Traveling all over the world. But yet, when you read the book, you fell down a bunch of times. Talk about where you got the will to lift yourself up, and why that is so important for everybody in their lives.
Well, that's one of those disadvantages, because in many respects, I had no alternative when I was a youngster. I mean, I had to get up in the morning and do it. And no matter how terrible the situation was a brand new school or a bunch of tough kids in the schoolyard, I had to do it. I can remember specifically one foster parent, I was being chased home by a bully, and I got to the house, I was huffing and puffing, and she says, what happened? She says, the guy's been chasing me, he's going to beat me up. And she sent me back out there. And I had to fight him, and it was the best thing that probably ever happened, because I hurt him. He hurt me worse, but the word got around, and if you fought with me, you got hurt. So there was a system that basically taught me to do that. And of course, I looked around and I learned what you just said. I found those people who didn't bounce back, didn't succeed. But look, I got the hubris when I was 33, 34 years old, being able to do everything. And I was a king of the world. And my fund was one of the best performing funds in the country. And it turned out long term to be one of the biggest funds in the country. I was the hero. I went every place. I drew crowds of people giving me money and so forth. But then I failed. 1972, I had a very bad record. Everybody turned on me. They started taking the money out of my fund. I had to sell the fund back to the parent company. And they said, well, you can come back, but you can never go home. So I had to start a whole new career. I went from what I call the buy side of the business, the sort of mutual fund business, to the sell side, which was the brokerage business. I had to learn a whole new business because I fouled up. And then the biggest knockdown to me is with Lehman Brothers. I did everything right. I mean, I changed their securities division. That's a brokerage business. And my boss and I didn't get along. You read in the book, we fought for, it was a 7-year war. In fact, I always say I was at Lehman Brothers from 1977 to 83, 16 years, because it felt like 16 years. And the boss basically, he wanted to control the whole brokerage business. So he pushed me into the money management business, which, was a bad deal just because it was a terrible operation at the time. I turned it around. I grew it from 2 billion to 10 billion in 2.5 years. And he wanted me to vote for him to be the CEO, pushing out the present CEO was Pete Peterson. And I said, no. And so he pushed me out of my job in the banking. So I spent 7 years doing everything right. And I was in no man's land. I was in banking.
There's one thing at Lehman I think you did extremely right, and I think it's worth just mentioning, because your boss, who people will read about, and most people have had a boss who was maybe not quite as egregious as this gentleman. I won't mention his name. They can read about it in the book. But he called you up and said, you need to fire 4 people from your division. And why don't you tell the listeners?
Well, I come to the company, and everybody told me not to come to, because this guy, his name is Lou Glucksman. It's been documented by many books. One called The Greed and Glory on Wall Street. And Lou was terrible, and everybody told me not to come. But I thought I was so smart that if I came, I'd bring people with me. Nobody wanted to come, but I really worked hard, and I finally got some people to come. And right in the middle of my hiring spree, he calls me and says, I just fired 4 people. Fire 4 of your people and bring them to me. So I arrived at his office by myself, and he said, well, I said, where are the 4 people? And I said, you're looking at them. And I said, you want to fire somebody, you fire me, because if I fire 4 people, I'm out of business. And he left me alone, but he tried to fire me a couple of times after that, and then finally, because he couldn't fire me, he pushed me out of my division. And by the way, there again, having pushed out was the best thing that ever happened to me. So, I'm not sure that God or fate, but things happen for the good reasons. I really wanted to run my own company. And when Lehman pushed me out, I got a chance to go to take over a small investment bank. And, I traded 200 people for 70 people. I traded 20 million in profits for 20 million in revenues. I traded the fanciest dining room on Wall Street for a conference room with 2 hot plates. I traded an office which looked over the entire southern Manhattan, the Statue of Liberty and everything. For my office looked over the building next door, the brick building. But I loved it because it was mine. And that was my passion. I found out that's what I go all the way back to college. That's what I really like to do, is put people together to basically accomplish a project or produce a product. And that I found a platform that I could really operate.
Well, the reason I wanted you to mention about the 4 people that he wanted you to fire and that you showed up yourself is because that is something, that's a leadership quality that is not evident. I think a lot of people would have brought 4 people to save their own butt, but you did something. Not only was it selfless, but I think it showed the people who work for you that we can trust that guy. And I can tell you that I have had many people working for me over the years. You have to, if you want people to work hard, I think as you mentioned in the book, you have to work harder, and they have to know you care, and you can't fake caring, right? Caring is not something you can make.
You can't fake care. Well, but what happened basically is all my partners thought I was crazy.
Right.
They thought I was, because Lou was all powerful, and he proved that. He not only that irritated me. He tried to fire me about a year and a half later. I overcame that. Then he finally pushed me out. And then finally, he pushed me out into another division. And then he pushed me out of that division. So he didn't give up. And if I would have gone along with him, I might have been better off, but I would have been worse off because I'd have lost my integrity, basically, because I knew I was right. And of course, after I left the firm in 1983, 7 months later, he destroyed the firm, and it's in the book. So not in my book, but also in The Greed and Glory on Wall Street, written by Ken Oletto, who did a great job. Lou was just, it was unfortunate, but I had to stand up. Now I was taking a lot of the risk at that point in time, because he probably could have fired me on the spot. I don't know I felt he probably couldn't do that because I thought the partners were behind me, but they may not have been. So I don't know. It was just my own, whatever it was, that said to him, look, you can't do this to me because I've spent the last year hiring a few people. I can't fire them right away. It doesn't work,
No, I think that's great advice for people who were leading.
I think if you stand, this is why my 4 Ps, the middle one is principles.
We're going to get to the 4 Ps in a minute, so don't worry.
Okay.
All right. But there are a few questions. Let's see. This is a good one. This is such an amazing story. Has your book been sold for a movie?
Well, unfortunately, Sean Connery just died, so I've lost the leading man. No, a couple people have said that. I can embellish the story a little bit if we have a movie. I told my wife that she's going to become instead of being a graduate student at the University of San Francisco, she's going to become a cocktail waitress at a smoky bar where I rescue her from a life of sin. So I've got to add a little something to the book if it becomes a movie. It may be a little too dull for a movie.
No, it's a great story. Here's another one. What advice do you have for children that are currently in foster care?
Well, I'm actually involved in a group called Wiley. And this is why the book has been a revelation for me. I'm glad I did it. I was planning not to do it. Wiley is a group in Boston which takes kids from foster homes that have been accepted into fine colleges like Harvard, Boston College, Tufts, MIT. And they ask the child whether they want counseling. And if the kid agrees to it, they assign a counselor that they must talk to once a week. I learned of this about a year and a half ago, and I've become a proponent of. I'm actually a poster child for it. They use I speak at all their conferences and so on and so forth. They have 72 kids in Boston, and they haven't had a failure yet, because I believe very strongly that mentoring, having parents, definitely, if they're good parents, or mentoring is the key to success. Kids don't flunk out academically; they flunk out socially. They get depressed and they get behind and they fail. So I think, now, by the way, not only do I find this group called Wiley, but I found a woman who consults for them. She told me there are 27 other organizations around the country that counsel foster kids. Now, I don't know if there are any orphanages left, one of the concepts I would love to do is to talk to kids in orphanages, but I don't think there's any left. But there are a lot of foster kids, foster parent kids. So they really do, because what happens to a foster kid, what happened to me, is you walk into this different environment. There's a real line in life when you come from high school or college, and you're so different. Now, less different today than they were in my day. In my day, poor kids didn't go to private colleges. I mean, they just didn't. I mean, and I have statistics from the 60s. I think 50 is probably when I went in 54. But after the 60s, less than 5% of the kids that went to college could afford it, and less than half of those graduated. So in 50, it must have been 1 or 2%. In fact, I don't remember a kid, a young man in my college or a young woman that was of had my problem, where they didn't have money. They couldn't afford to go to college.
Yeah, it's an incredible journey, and I think that's why it's when people read this book, they're going to be stunned at what you went through.
Well, you know, I always say it wasn't my fault. I just went through it.
Well, you not only went through it, you soared through it. So that's the fascinating part of the story. You're not the first person who was abandoned as a child and lived in foster homes and orphanages. It's what you made of it. That's the message, and that's why I think this book is so important. It's not just that you had a tough time. It's that you turned a tough time into an amazing life, a life not only professionally tremendously successful, but a wonderful marriage, wonderful children and grandchildren, all the charitable work you've done, the contributions you've made, not just to your University of Rochester, and still you are finding new organizations. So you have taken, it's not just that you had a tough time, Ed, but the amazing thing about your story is what you did with it. And one of the things you mentioned earlier is that you decided not to be a victim. And boy, are we in a victim mentality world now? And I look at it, and I'd like you to comment on this, that it's not just that it's unpleasant to listen to or annoying. It's that you feel for the people that are missing out. Being a victim is about the worst choice one can make, and it is a choice. And I know it sounds harsh, but you're the perfect person to speak to this. It's hard to have more. I won't say more adversity, but you certainly are in that category of a lot of adversity, you could have easily been a victim. You chose not to. How do you feel when you look at this world now, where it seems that there are victims everywhere, even victims who are, who may become part of royal families that use some.
You started out with the concept of an optimist. There's more opportunity now than ever before. Before COVID, we didn't have any ways of solving COVID. So you got a whole new set of opportunities, really, in many respects. You've got all the other stuff that's just going absolutely crazy right now. Genomics, artificial intelligence, VR, virtual reality, artificial reality, Alzheimer's. We've got to cure Alzheimer's. I mean, you can pick almost any field. Plus, what I call the vocational period, you've got a whole layer of required technical help. We all endowed a little bit differently. I mean, I don't look down on my electrician or my carpenter. He does things I can't do. I want people to find their passion and pursue it. And so, I think being a victim is really one of the real problems. Today, there's more opportunity than there ever was before. When I went to school, we didn't have international. I wanted to be an international businessman. It was too early. I really couldn't spend really good time over there because it really didn't work in the 60s. It wasn't until the 80s till international really came home. Today, and by the way, the other thing, if you started a business in my time, you needed money. Today, you got one of these little bloody screens, and you got 50 or 100 people who love you, and you start a blog, and you sell something over there. You find something that somebody else manufactured, and you sell it, and you're in business. And so I think that the opportunity is enormous today. I mean, and also you're legitimizing things, like video games, which I just awful. I thought they were terrible. Hell, you have teams at colleges now that do video games. It's become a whole new business. A friend of mine, his son is getting a master in video game technology. So there's whole different areas that could be that coming to view right now. So I'm very optimistic about that particular thing. I think we have to stop being victims. I'm trying to get people off COVID and thinking about other things. Still got to wear a mask. Still got to do some distancing. You can't be foolish. I've gotten both my injections. Everybody should get vaccinated. So on, all that sort of stuff. But then let's take our mind off this and go on to the next step. We've got a big problem. We are the ruling nation in the world, and there are one major rising nation. And if you read Graham Allison's book called Thucydides' Trap, the ruling nation and the rising nation have difficulty. He covered the last 2,500 years. There's 16 examples, and in 12 examples there was war. And we've got to prevent that. Somehow we have to get together with the Chinese and help help each other to make the world a better place. And I think that really is the game plan.
let's talk. We don't have a lot of time left, but I knew this was going to happen. I knew we were going to run out of time because we could
Oh,
talk.
oh my, sorry. I
We could
talked too
talk. No,
long.
no, this is great. We could talk forever. There's so much in your book, and I think bringing out all these themes is so valuable. I do want you to talk a little bit at the end of the book. You talk about the 4 Ps. You mentioned them: passion, principles, partners, and plans. This is clearly something, a synthesis of your thinking over the years. Maybe you can spend a few minutes explaining what that's about.
Well, I go back. My feeling is the only constant, we only have one constant in life, and that's your inner voice. And my contention is you develop your own language. I develop my language. You got to develop a language of your inner voice so that you have a real partner inside. And this used to be your conscience is on your shoulder, God, whatever it is, you really have to have a conversation with your inner voice. And I said, the most important thing about the conversation with the inner voice is a simple language that you can go back to. And I happen to come up in my lifetime what I call the 4 Ps. Find your passions, which is an overused word. It's talents, interests, what's available, all these things. When I discuss it, I go into much more detail, and your passions change. You may want to be a fireman or a policeman when you're 4 and an astronaut when you're 9, but you end up being a businessman when you're 22. So my passion changed. Math and science, I started with that, and baseball and basketball. And I said girls, I took that out of the book, but and that morphed into chemical engineering, and then chemical engineering moved into management eventually. Principles, the golden rule. I learned it very early at the Catholic schools. And people who have religion, I envy you because it really sets a set of rules early that you can live by. You draw lines that you can't cross. So when you get to a Glucksman or something like that, there's certain things you just won't do. I mean, I have a friend who was in jail, and he did cross that line because he didn't have the principles well established. And I use the golden rules as an interesting example because there was another golden rule in my life. Is he who has the gold rules, which says how much of your time you're going to dedicate to financial resources. And that's a real fork in the road. And for me, it was no fork because I had no money. I wanted money. Now, but that changed too. That principle changed. First, I had to get money because when I was 28 years old, I had a negative net worth. I owed Harvard Business School $6,000 or $8,000. And I actually had to get an advance to get to my first job. I really had to make money. But as I got older, when I took the job from Lehman to Furman Cells, money was not that important. I had enough. But I had to get enough. So that principle even changed. And all through my life, freedom became a very important principle to me. I wanted to go to a place where I would have freedom. That's why I went to a small firm. Big firm, too much politics, not good for me. I learned who I was. Then long term, the biggest principle of all that came in my life in my 50s was gratitude. And I have to bring up my friend who basically, and I recommend this to you to think about, a good friend of mine named Walter Green wrote a book called This Is the Moment. It's a fabulous book. It's a very tiny little book. What he did at age 70, he stopped everything. He was an executive in a nonprofit. He made a list of 44 people who had been an impact on his life. And he went and visited each one physically, wrote down and told them and thanked them for what they did for him. And halfway through the year, his wife said, write a book. And he wrote a book. And
let's stick with that for a second. I know we haven't gotten to the partners and plans, but I think this is very important. You mentioned that you take stock of your life, and I think you said annually you review what you're doing. And you and I had a private conversation where I said it's funny you should say that because I literally evaluate. Maybe I'm tougher on myself than you are. I evaluate myself at the end of every day, and I basically, along the gratitude, my measure is how many people did I help today. And why don't you talk about this a little bit more about why this idea of self-evaluation and grading yourself in terms of what you've done is so important.
I believe that you have to take, I believe, unlike, I don't grade myself every day. I think it's very hard. You may be able to do that. What I say is we used to go on a boat, and every year I would take a certain amount of time with yellow pad and write down certain things I did and didn't do and so forth. That was kind of a skinny dive. I believe when you take a project, whatever it might be, try to give it at least 3 years. Then 3 years, really take the time and tear it apart and see if you're getting out of it what you want. Because if you're willing to change, I mean, I changed from engineering to business, and it saved my life. If I would have stayed in the chemical business, I would never be as successful as I am today. The chemical business could have leveled off in the 60s, even though Dustin Hoffman was supposed to go into plastics like I did. It leveled off. When I went to the financial business, it was just getting started. Mm-hmm. So being able to change is very, very important. And I think evaluating what you're getting out of it, what you're getting, is this really a passion of yours anymore? And every 3 years to take real stock. And I keep those yellow pads. I have a pile of yellow pads, and I draw lines on them. Because when you write something down and look at it, It's very different than thinking or talking.
I think you're right. So Ed, believe it or not, we've come to the end of this wonderful time. I just want to say one thing. I'm going to guess that there are a lot of people listening who just want to give you a hug, because that's the kind of guy you are. I think when people should read this book, they'll read the chronology of what brought you.
You left out the most important thing I ever did, which was to create a golf course in Nantucket.
Yeah, well, anyway, they can read it. That's in the book. They can read about it, right? But anyway, I want to thank you so much. You know, your goal is to make the world better, and we've talked this. My goal is to work the world better, and I hope that we'll be able to do some things together. Selfishly, it's been a wonderful chance for me to talk with you tonight. I think your lessons are great for everybody, and people should read this book and learn how you got to where you are. Here's the book, On the Road Less Traveled. I highly recommend you read it. Buy it tonight. Click the button at the bottom. You get a 10% discount.
And the Audible is available. And by the way, Mark, you've already proven to me